Hello and welcome to Moneylife. This is Sucheta Dalal. It's 2 months almost since we've got this hard lockdown in the country. 1.3 billion people locked down in what was hailed as a really bold move. But just think about it. Aren't there several parallels between demonetization of 2016 and this hard lockdown? Yeah, well, you would say that this is a virus, nothing to do with black money. But think about it. Demonetization was hailed as this wonderful move that was going to eradicate corruption and black money from the country. Ultimately, who suffered? Who died? Who lost jobs? The poorest Indians. And what's happening in the lockdown? This is again about the elite. Corona didn't come from the slums. Corona came on planes from some of the richest Indians who had gone abroad, or people who came from abroad and weren't quarantined, weren't tested when they came back, even when there were plenty of signals that there is a problem and the virus could come to India. All the signs were there. We had no checks. And now who is affected? Millions of migrants, because you had this hard lockdown announced on the 24th, just 4 hours short of midnight, and suddenly everything was shut down. It was hailed as a bold move by a strong leader, and look at what we have today. The truth is coming out. We have all evidence that it was unplanned. People were clueless that there are millions of people who would be stranded. Apart from migrant workers, there are Indians, students, people stranded abroad, students stranded across the country, fishermen, and nobody even knew that they existed or that they would have serious issues. They couldn't have remained where they are. So the crisis that has evolved has actually led to a spread, far from the lockdown having helped. So lockdown was argued as being a way to level the curve, to stop the spread. In fact, we don't even have a face saver of it having done that. We would have gone through hardships for 2 months with a smile if it had actually helped. But today, as we record this, we have the highest rise in corona cases. In fact, let's look at the numbers from the government website. 22nd May, and the government website shows that there are 66,330 corona cases active as of now, 48,533 recoveries, which is pretty good, and 3,583 reported deaths. And I say reported because there are many unreported. Doctors tell me that a lot of people are not being reported because of the process that if a person is suspected of COVID and dies, then a test has to be conducted. The body has to remain for a couple of days, which is almost impossible in today's conditions, has caused controversy. So many doctors are very happily certifying deaths as malaria, which has its own consequences because there's no quarantine, there's no contact tracing, and there is no lockdown of those people when it happens. But this is not the end of the misery. The point is, did we have any warning that this may not work? In fact, we did. So let me read out a couple of things. This Mr. Ramesh Thakur, former UN Assistant Secretary General and a global expert, who actually has been writing and warning that maybe India needs to look at a trade-off between the number of lives saved and the damage that we are going to allow to be done to our economy. We didn't listen to him. He's written articles globally and in India. In fact, he says, in India, look at the number of deaths. There's still very few as compared to the rest of the world. So he says COVID-19 was never a serious public health threat for India, given the low number of cases and deaths in the initial phase. Remember, initial phase. Instead of self-harm from the harsh lockdown, India could have invested in urgently upgrading its rickety public health system and ensured permanent gains. Did we listen? No. Exactly as with demonetization, people who had nothing to do with the crisis have suffered. Migrant workers are walking on the highways, and there is unseemly, disgusting politicking over whether it is a problem, why are they going back, why aren't they satisfied, and who should pay for them. Hopefully that is resolving. And while all this is going on, 2 months down the line, in fact, to the date since the lockdown, we're going to have the aviation sector open up again for the elite. So while migrants are walking, they have no water, they have no food, they're being ripped off on plane and bus fares, we have aviation opening up with caps. downward cap and upward cap in pricing, and elaborate rules. Again, the elite win and rules are made for them. This is absolutely appalling in a secular democratic republic like ours. So the question is, where did we go wrong? What was our game plan when we did this lockout? And why is it that our response to the coronavirus has been so arbitrary? Now, before we go into that, let's look at it. Did people warn? I said yes. This very interesting article, Why Flattening the Curve is Overrated, has been going viral. Now, the author argues 3 or 4 points. One is, he says social distancing provides the illusion of control and not actual control over the virus. We've seen that, right? Because now, in spite of so-called social distancing, the high-end society is being locked up, the virus is all over, you don't dare to go back to normal. Since there's no vaccine, again, flattening the curve, which was supposed to prevent pressure on the public health system, hasn't worked. Because were there a vaccine, people would have been inoculated with everyone going home to taking care. So you get locked down for a couple of weeks, and this time is actually used to ensure that you are inoculated against the vaccine, against the virus. But there is no vaccine. So that hasn't worked either. So what was the purpose of the lockdown? What was the end game? Remember, we are not talking about India here. This is an international article, and this is how the whole world has bungled. The point is that while the world has bungled, India's problems are a little different. But before that, let's come to it. Nobody, even around the world, has discussed what would be the successful lifting of the lockdown. In the sense, what will happen? Will there be a second round? When you lift the lockdown, there will be an increase in cases once again. So will you lock down again, or will you learn to deal with it? If there is a second round and a third round of the virus rearing its head again, what happens? Do we just shut down the economy? Obviously, that is a huge price to pay. And any number of academic, scholarly articles written by experts and professionals which say that no time in economic history has this kind of a lockdown been tried all around the world. You could say we've never had a pandemic like this, but people didn't plan for how to lift the lockdown in any country. What are the consequences? What are the circumstances under which we will lift it, or we will learn to deal with it, right? The economic cost is huge. This level of unemployment and slowdown has never been witnessed probably since the Spanish flu or the Great Depression. Are we in India prepared to deal with it? It is scary, and yet a lot of people don't even seem to understand. 15 days ago, Rajiv Bajaj of Bajaj Auto actually raised some of these questions. He kept asking that if you want us to restart, will the supply chains work? What is the plan? What happens if there's a flare-up again? And people were hailing him even then for being so bold as to ask the right questions. Well, Naushad Forbes, formerly of the CII and from Forbes Marshall, has again raised these questions, and he makes some really important points in an article in the Business Standard, where he says that this lockdown has enhanced the power of the bureaucracy, and forget about ease of doing business. In the name of the lockdown, in the name of protection of people, the number of hurdles in our path have increased so much that we actually are in danger of going back to the really bad old days of the 1970s and 80s, which was probably the worst period in India, where you had to stand in queue for just about everything. So let me read a little bit about what Mr. Forbes has said. He makes really important points. He says, let's not slide back to a license Raj, and let's not stifle the economy. So government has asked companies from May 18th to start working again. Is it feasible? Is it practical? He says that we can't get back to productivity even if we want to. We are working at 25% capacity because of the hurdles in our path. So here's what he says. We need passes for everything. We need a pass to bring people to work. We need a pass to source packaging material, a pass to get the logistics providers in, another pass to get a truck in and on its way to customers, a pass even to take a letter of credit document to the bank, or product certificates to a boiler inspector. Each takes time and is variably interpreted by each individual policeman on the way. Don't we know it? couple of days ago, Moneylife wrote another article about this, where an employer in Pune, waiting patiently until May 18th, decided that he will take permission, hire a car, and send his domestic help back to her village because her 4 children were away from her for 2 months. And the nightmare that they had on the way, because they were stopped at every checkpost, it needed us with some activist friends, well-known activists like Vinita Deshmukh and Vijay Kumbar, to make calls to several SPs of the police so that they went past each checkpost. A medical certificate of Pune was not accepted in the next district. They had to go to a medical officer again. It was a hellish nightmare. And were it not for the fact that he called a bunch of journalists who could make the right calls, they would have probably come back to Pune and not been allowed to go in spite of the permissions, in spite of following all the rules. So extrapolate this to business, which has a supply chain, which needs to get goods, facilities, supplies from all over to make a product. And you can imagine the nightmare that's going on, because when something is coming in a truck, imagine having to trace it, tracking your courier every step of the way, because they're going to be stopped again and again and again. And believe me, a pandemic, like I've said in another blog, is also a time for mindless corruption. It's not only, yes, there are very good policemen, there are very good healthcare people, many have lost their lives in their duty, they've been out on the roads. So we are not tarnishing everybody by the same brush or casting aspersions, but there is a tremendous amount of rent seeking and corruption going on as well, which is why people are being stopped every step of the way, and there has been no hesitation in asking bribes either. Now, as always, none of this affects the affluent. So you have people who are sitting on comfortable salaries, haven't lost their jobs, sitting in fancy societies, busy with webinars and Zoom calls, ordering stuff online, who think that the world is beautiful because we are so secured. All the dirt and the problems that are happening outside don't affect them. Well, wake up and smell the coffee. If you're happy to believe that all the stories about migrant labor on the roads and their suffering is all made up by anti-national people, think again. It is the reality of India. It is the poor who suffer. And you will get a wake-up call when you need to use a hospital. What is happening at hospitals is a nightmare, because India is a country where very few people have died of COVID-19. Many have recovered. But we are a people who suffer from strokes, heart attacks, diabetes, which is called a comorbidity, and there are many, many thousand more deaths every year from these diseases, which means that you need hospitals all the time. So yes, people have put routine procedures on hold. You may not be going for simple tests because you're paranoid, but when you have a problem, do you find a hospital? We in Moneylife Foundation are doing work with hospitals. In the last 2 days, I've had at least 2 doctors in the group from some of the biggest hospitals in Bombay on a hunt for a hospital bed for one of their own. And they found it so difficult. It was with great difficulty, in spite of their contacts, that they managed it. We've heard of people dying because they're going from one hospital to another in search of a bed. We've heard about private hospitals ripping off people. We've heard of 4,000 rupees plus being charged for a PPE when it should be 1/4 of the cost. We've heard of mindless costs of procedures because they have done you the great favor of admitting you when there is no hospital bed. Surely this can't go on. Now, the government, we in Moneylife have again talked about N95 masks. In fact, I'm in court with our activist Anjali Damania and with advocate Mihir Desai, very happily taking it up for us to help the public cause. The case is going on, Tariq pe Tariq. In fact, today was one of the days. It's going on to next Friday. We don't know what's going to happen. All we are asking is cap the price. Don't steal from us by doubling and trebling rates. The same masks were available at 30 and 50 rupees in February, and today they are being sold at nothing less than 200 rupees. You're lucky if you get it for 140. Why are we using a pandemic to be ripped off like this? It's a simple question, right? So the state pretends to respond to it. So last night there was a circular from the Maharashtra government with an elaborate list of every procedure and saying what private hospitals also can charge. These are what I call 5-star hospitals, expensive. So every kind of procedure. Now it's another matter that most people are not getting admitted for these procedures at all. So you wonder who and why. It's this long list. Who has the time to do it when more pressing things aren't done? But fine, we have a list. What is more important in this list is what is excluded. So if you thought that this is for you and me, think again. It is actually being done in such great detail, obviously for the insurance companies. Because people who have 100% insurance, if they get admitted to these hospitals, it is the insurer who will pay. That is why it's in such detail. What is more interesting is what is excluded. So the things that we are fighting for, the PPEs and the N95 masks, are out of this cap. There is no cap over there. It's excluded. Why does this happen? Well, my guess is that because insurance by and large doesn't cover these things. Insurance, even if it's 100%, doesn't cover some things, and these are some of them, right? So again, the system is working for the people who have the power and the influence. You have the power to make rules for yourself. You have the influence to get in. The rest of us can be ripped off. Doesn't matter how much we fight, and nothing ever moves for us. What can be a bigger injustice in this country than a government saying that we will start aviation when migrant labor is still walking on the roads, being ripped off on buses and trucks, and struggling to get into trains? But aviation is restarted with a cap. We, the people who have to wear masks all the time, I keep saying don't wear an N95, leave them for the medical professionals. All doctors are desperately short of them. There's no cap on it. Why? Why this injustice? Why are we misusing this pandemic? And when will we admit that this hard lockdown of 1.3 billion people was a mistake? In fact, it helped spread it to people who had no truck with corona, who would not have been infected except by a few people in elite housing societies where they're working for them. But we have created a spread. We have no end game in sight. We don't know how we are going to lift it, and we don't know what is going to happen to our healthcare. We have to worry about what happens when we have the ordinary illnesses that are nicely called lifestyle diseases. Yes, our lifestyles will change, but believe me, we are in for a really uncertain future. Thank you.